The police had been aware of the young girl sleeping in the park for about a week. Despite their desire to help her, she consistently turned them away. Frustrated, they decided to follow her to uncover the reason behind her situation. What they found about this vulnerable girl left the officers deeply unsettled. After tracking her from the park this morning, the officers felt uncertain about their next steps. They hadn't anticipated her leading them to this particular place. It didn't take long for them to learn why the girl chose to spend her nights in the park. The reasoning was clear, yet it was difficult for the officers to accept. They were eager to assist her, but they felt powerless in the face of her choice. While they had to respect the girl's decision, they couldn't overlook the circumstances that had driven her to it. Why was she sleeping in the park each night? Where had she taken them? And what could be done about her plight? The first night bystanders noticed her on the park bench, they promptly called the police. Though homelessness was common in the area and often overlooked, the sight of a young girl stirred a sense of urgency in the community. As expected, the police dispatched an officer to speak with her, hoping to guide her to her parents or a shelter. However, the girl firmly rebuffed all attempts to assist her. The police couldn't compel anyone to accept help, so they had to leave the little girl alone, though they were far from satisfied with that outcome. Her presence lingered in their minds, especially as concerned citizens continued to call about her every night and morning. It was evident she was sleeping in the park each night since their first encounter. This was alarming, as she could easily become a target for those with ill intentions lurking in the city at night. However, the officers began to notice something peculiar over the past week. Reports about the girl only came in during the late evening, night, and early morning hours. Throughout the day, no one seemed to have any information about her. Perhaps the public felt less threatened when she was awake. But with so many more people in the park during the day, it was odd that no one reported seeing her. What could she be doing at that time? It was clear that something unusual was happening. The officers felt a blend of curiosity and concern. While it was indeed a mystery, their primary worry was for the girl's safety. They knew they needed to find a way to help her. 2 rookie officers were assigned the task, given straightforward instructions: monitor the girl while she slept and discreetly follow her once she woke up. It seemed manageable, and they headed out as soon as the first call of the night came in. When they arrived at the park, they found the girl nestled on her blanket with her teddy bear, fast asleep on the bench. As anticipated, calls began to pour in. This was a nightly occurrence, but for the first time, they could report that they were actively investigating the situation. The officers parked their cars at the far end of the street, doing their best to remain inconspicuous. They took turns watching over the sleeping girl, prioritizing her safety while ensuring not to disturb her or draw attention. Tomorrow, however, would bring new challenges. Thankfully, the night was uneventful. Besides a few worried strangers, no one seemed to interact with the young girl. Instead, some would tap her to ask if she needed help, and others would do a quick breath check or dial the department to report a homeless child. But as luck would have it, that was it. No one did anything more to her, and they were thankful for that, as it was not the safest part of town to be in at night. In the end, the girl's response remained the same. She refused any help and simply went back to sleep. A few people, however. The rookie cops did notice that a few people barely acknowledged the sleeping child. Most of them were dog owners who likely came across her every night. The locals knew that the girl rejected help from strangers. But this only raised more questions. If the girl was really only sleeping at night, why here? Before they knew it, morning had arrived. The officers were tired, but it was great practice for stakeouts. They also knew that this was the most critical time, as they would need to be alert to properly investigate what happened to the mysterious girl during the day. Now, all she needed to do was wake up. A short while later, the two officers watched as the young girl got up. The sun wasn't out yet, and the morning crowd wasn't due for a few more minutes. However, the girl was fast at work. She grabbed her things and placed them gently into a bag. It was clear to the officers that she had a routine. They watched her leave the bench and dart towards the park exit. The little girl moved quickly while the officers followed her at a close distance. They wanted to quicken their pace, but knew they could not risk getting caught by her, or she might change her morning plans. Once the park was at a distance, the little girl didn't seem as focused on her destination. At first, they worried that she had somehow spotted their tail, but it was soon apparent that she was simply taking her time as she made her way through the city's busy streets. But she did something alarming. The officers expected her to stay around the crowds in the city, but instead, she was headed in the opposite direction, towards the abandoned part of town. It was the oldest part of the town, and had lost most of its residents during city redevelopment. So just what could she be doing there? The young girl walked for a while longer. But just when they slowed their pace, she took a hard left between the houses. The cops watched in surprise when she stopped in front of a house and knocked. But even more surprising was watching the door open as she walked in seconds later. The house was old and worn down, but it didn't seem like it would collapse anytime soon. So if there were people inside who clearly knew and welcomed her in, why was the young girl sleeping at the park every night? And just what were the people inside up to? The officers watched it all happen from a safe distance. Once the door shut, they followed closely behind. Reaching the front door, they knocked and announced their presence. But to their surprise, they were greeted by silence and no one moved to open the door. What was going on? The officers were puzzled by the turn of events. They knew the house was occupied, at the very least, by the little girl, and whoever had opened the door for her moments before. But there was no answer. After a few moments of waiting, one of the officers noticed the curtains ruffle on the side. Someone was indeed watching. The officer who had noticed the curtain signaled to her partner, who nodded his understanding. They knocked once more, this time louder, and insisted that they were responding to an emergency call. They requested to view the home and ascertain that it was compliant with safety codes. But the response they received was surprising. It was true, it was simply a ploy to get the child or whoever was with her to open the door. But to their surprise, the response they received put a halt to their schemes. A frail but confident voice echoed from the other side of the door. "Do you have a warrant, officer?" The officers frowned. They, of course, did not have a warrant in their possession. No judge would issue one with so little evidence either. They were stuck. But now, they knew one thing for sure. Whoever was involved with the little child was old or knowledgeable enough to request a warrant. Although the situation only seemed to get more complicated, the officers felt stumped. Although they could tell something suspicious, at the very least, was going on, there was little way of proving to a judge that it was worth it. They would need to come up with a plan in the meanwhile. One of the officers had an idea. Coughing, she spoke, "Guess we'll have to go pick up that warrant after all. Should be about an hour, right?" The other officer smiled and nodded before yelling out his agreement. Then both officers walked towards their car and sped off. But they were not headed for the station. Instead, they parked a block away and sat in the vehicle. They were back on stakeout duty. It was true they had little chance of getting a warrant, but whoever was behind the door did not know that, giving them a perfect opportunity to observe the house and possibly gain the probable cause they needed for the warrant. Once more, the officers took shifts as they observed the situation. But like the night before, nothing happened. at least not anything that would justify a warrant. There were little noises heard from the house, but it was impossible to tell what was truly happening with the curtains drawn together in the dimly lit house. The officers began to fear that their suspicions had been just that. Had they wasted a day observing an unofficial shelter? Just as they debated returning to the station to report their findings, things suddenly took a surprising turn. The front door opened, and this time, it wasn't just the little girl who came out. The officers could not believe their eyes. Multiple kids came out of the house. They were all dressed in worn-out and drabby clothes. Some of them had no shoes, but they all had one thing in common. They carried brand-new, nondescript backpacks. This was certainly something to work with. The officers were stopped in shock. Now there was no doubt something shady was going on. They debated following the little girl, who they noticed was part of the kids wearing the backpacks. After all, she was their initial assignment. But they were quickly interrupted by the appearance of a new set of children. Now, this is getting interesting. Like the children who stepped out of the house, this pair of kids were dressed just as shabby, with the same nondescript backpacks being carried. But they observed that one thing separated the two groups. These backpacks seemed a lot lighter. What was being carried? One of the officers quickly pulled out a cell phone and started recording the scene in front of them. There was no doubt that this was suspicious enough to create probable cause. The right DA was sure to get them the coveted warrant in no time, but something else needed to be done. The officers agreed to split up. They would cover more ground this way. One of them would stay and wait for the warrant, while the other would follow the girl to see if she was once more heading to the park, or if something more troubling was going on as they suspected. Once the video was shown and the evidence recounted, the judge was more than on board. The fact that the case involved children made it all the more necessary to solve before something fatal occurred. The warrant was signed and backup was called. But on the other side of town, the second officer stumbled on something troubling. The squad cars were loaded, and the liaison from Child Protective Services was called in to supervise the operation. This would hopefully be handled quickly and with care. But none of the officers felt at ease. They all knew something terrible was going on, and it angered them that innocent children were being roped into it. Soon the officers made it to the scene. This time they announced the warrant and demanded to be let in. But still, there was no response. The officers knew the house was occupied by little children, and so to avoid any dangerous turns, the officers barged into the house and announced their presence. The officers were shocked at the scene in front of them. They moved quickly to check the house for any weapons or hostile adults. But these officers were not the only ones witnessing something shocking. The officer who had followed the young girl was surprised to watch her make a mysterious delivery. The house looked worse on the inside than it did outside. It smelled of stale food and dirty children. The flooring was falling apart and the walls were stained. The house was filled with children, some sleeping on the floors with what looked like their prized possessions, and others sat at the tables working to repackage water bottles. The entire ordeal was heartbreaking. The officers later discovered that the owner of the house had lured the homeless children into the house by promising them shelter in exchange for a small stipend and shelter, while he used the children to produce and transport the products. The other officer who had followed the little girl had watched her make a similar delivery before she returned to the park. The bottles were all seized and sent to be tested, while the children were removed from the house. The little girl explained that she chose the park because the house was far too crowded to sleep in. The police officers were glad to get the children out of the home and quickly opened a case against the owner of the house. He was arrested and awaits trial, as he had engaged in child labor exploitation and a host of other illegal activities. But they still worried for the children. The children were all taken by Child Protective Services, and luckily, over a series of months, many of the children were returned to their parents or closest living relatives, while others were put into the foster care system, some of which were adopted. But people were most curious about the little girl who had started it all. Although the custody officials tried to rehouse her, they soon discovered that she was an orphan, with no close relatives to be found. The little girl insisted she is allowed to return to the park, but it was illegal as she is a minor. Instead, she was placed into a foster home and allowed to visit the park often as she felt most at home there.